We are
Introduction.
live. Dick, we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Kubek. I'm chair of Abraham's Table, and I want to welcome you to the last of our 2020 programs. And applying the adjective last to 2020 is a very happy thing to do. This has truly been an honest, horribilis, horrible year. Interestingly, the Times had a story today that the scientists now think the first COVID case may have been in December. And it was last December, it seems like 2 years ago, but it was last December that we hosted a program about gratitude. And maybe a year ago to this day, actually. It was an in-person program, obviously. And one of the questions that came up in this otherwise upbeat program about gratitude was, what do we do when there's suffering and there's pain and there's nothing to be grateful for? And little did we know what was about to befall all of us. So that led us to our April program, where we explored with this panel, wonderful panel, we've invited back for the third time. We explored the question of how our faith was helping us to cope with the suffering of COVID. Very powerful program. And one of the coping mechanisms, obviously, is prayer. So that led to our June program on why do we pray? And that in turn has led us to tonight's program about holiness. So we'll be introducing that in a few minutes, but I do want to say a few words about our upcoming program. On January 17th, we're going to be hosting our annual Martin Luther King Interfaith Service. It will be virtual. And the theme this year is understanding and healing Long Island's racial divides. So it's very, very timely, given the racial reckoning that our nation has gone through, along with COVID over the last year. We also have two wonderful programs that we had to postpone, but they're not going away. And one of them is a program that's going to be live after COVID on how to have difficult conversations with one another. And the other is an outgrowth of why do we pray? And that will be a program on how and where do we pray? And we're hoping to open our places of worship once we return to them, so we can visit one another, possibly through video or maybe in person. So again, join us on January 17th for Martin Luther King. And at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Deacon Jean Doherty, and we will begin. So thanks again for joining us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Deacon Jean Doherty from St. Andrew's Lutheran Church in Smithtown and Abiding Presence Lutheran Church in Fort Salonga. Before I introduce our panel, I did want to just direct those that have not joined us before to abrahamstableli.org, where you can find our past events, our upcoming events, and also our email. So if you'd like to share your own email so you could get communications from us, you can go to our website for that further information. Okay, so our format today, before I introduce our panel, for the next hour, we're going to have 4 questions, and we're going to do a round robin with each of our panelists. And then for our last half hour, you'll be able to ask your questions. So as you're listening, you can put in the chat, and we'll get to your questions. Mehmet Tatik from our committee is our tech support, and he'll make sure all of your questions get over to us, and we'll answer as many as the panel has time for, concluding about 5:30. Okay, so on to our panelists. First, we have Rabbi Jeffrey Klepper, the spiritual leader of Temple Beth El in Huntington since 2003. We have Dr. Zuleha Kolak, a professor at Columbia University who teaches Turkish language and Islamic literature. She's also affiliated with the Islamic Cultural Center of New York, and especially the one that we have located right here in Ronkonkoma. And we also have Reverend Kate Jones Cologne, a spiritual leader since 2011 at Setauket Presbyterian Church. Many of you have seen them before. We welcome them back, as Dr. Kubek mentioned. And we will get started with our first question to the rabbi.
Uh-oh.
Here we go. In your tradition, how do you define holiness, and what is it that makes someone holy?
So first, let me just thank Dick Kubek for Abraham's Table and welcoming us all back. Dick, I kind of thought when you were talking about bring us back a third time, third time's the charm. Or maybe the idea was, maybe this time we would get it right. I'm not sure. But I'm so excited to be a part of this program and to be with these amazing colleagues that I even feel like I learned so much from the two of them. So I'm grateful to be here. And Jean Doherty, look forward to getting to know you as we go forward. So the question at hand, holiness. It was so interesting to have this question raised, because I know it's a word that's often used in religious contexts. And the truth is that even now, after the question being raised and starting to look through, so many sources and biblical texts and commentaries, I still struggle to be able to define in words what holiness is. It's almost because, maybe it's because it seems like a difficult thing to attain, especially in human life. But, for me, of course, looking through the lens of the Bible, and especially the beginning of what, some would call the Old Testament, or what we would refer to as Torah, those first 5 books, there's actually, it starts with a commandment, a point in the book of Leviticus where God speaking to Moses and says to tell the people, you shall be holy, for I, God, am holy. Okay. Kiddushim tehiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai. All right. So we start there, and it really does very little to explain to us what does that mean. It sounds like we're being told that God is the ultimate figure of, or example of, or emanator of this thing called holiness. But then there's almost like, okay, let's try to figure out what this means, whether that's based on what comes directly after it, which is a whole bunch of rules that the rabbis long ago called the Holiness Code, or it's all these other stories and events and things happening using the same word. And Hebrew has a lot of grammar connections that I won't go into and really bore the socks off everybody. But every time this word kadosh is used, does that give us any clue? And I think it's kind of difficult to narrow it down. With one exception, in Judaism, what has come out of it is this sense of, okay, so holiness, God, we're supposed to be like God, but obviously we can't be God. Only God can be God. So what does this mean? And what Judaism sort of came to was this definition that really has been helpful for me, of that maybe we can't define what holiness is, but we can see it juxtaposed to things that are not holy. Okay. It's almost like 2 categories. There's the stuff that's holy or holiness, and there's the stuff that's mundane, like everyday things. Okay. So the example I know I used with this group, and I'll mention, it's like when you have an object, it's just an object. But when you use that object in a particular way, all of a sudden it takes on this sense of holiness. Okay. If I light a candle in my house because I like candles, or I like how a candle looks, that's just a candle. But if I light a candle on Friday night because it's Shabbat, then that's holy. So holiness kind of seems to suggest, at least from the Jewish perspective, this sense of specialness, this sense of maybe to some extent godlike, although again, we have to unpack what that means, which is a kind of a long venture unto itself. But maybe it's that, it's this idea of things that are raised to a higher level of specialness because of a mindfulness that we bring to it, that brings us either closer to God or closer to an understanding or feeling that God's here with us, that there's divinity close by. So that's kind of a nutshell, and obviously we'll unpack more, but I would say that when it comes to Judaism, it's that sense of holiness is this way that we can bring God into the regular world, and have divine mindfulness, often through objects or feelings.
Thank you, Rabbi. Professor, how would your faith tradition define holiness?
Um, First of all, I would like to welcome all and just to express my gratitude to be here with us again. I still remember the excitement and the energy that we had in the last event on gratitude. So I'm very grateful to be here as well. So when we think about holiness in our tradition, I think the first concept that we need to work on is wholeness, because the revelation or the message that we received is a message that has come to all. Like it's a continuation of the message, as it is in Judaism, as it is in Christianity. At different times and at different parts of the world, we kept receiving the message from the source, from the creator, from the divine. So that wholeness is one aspect of holiness. Like the message is coming from the source to us all. So there is a divide between us as created beings and he, the divine, the creator, the holy. And these two categories, I think, help us to understand the divide and where we are and how we reach the divine. So the term itself in Arabic comes from the root of Quds, Ka, De, and Se, similar to the term that Rabbi used. And so it means pureness. So to reach our original pureness, we come to this world with our, pure, essential, being. And then this is a potential. We are pure, but it's a potential at the same time. So in our journey of life, we try to strive our best to be connected with the holy, divine. So, and also at the same time to blossom the seeds that we have as pure in ourselves. So not to disrupt, not to destroy, but keep it, preserve it, but make it better every day by being connected with him. So the concept of sacred and holy are two concepts that are very similar to each other. For us, in our understanding, like we do not become God-like, but we become closer to him. We become in our understanding, in our connectedness, we become closer to him. And also the perfect, we become perfect in our own being as a human being. There is this concept of perfect human being. So that is the, eventual target of us. Like whatever I strive for in my life here, eventually what comes out of me as a person is my perfection, whatever, I did here. So to realize this potential, I think the most important thing in this journey is to realize that, first of all, in our own essence, we do not have anything on our own, like we are not the source of whatever we have been given. And also, we are being constantly created as the whole universe is being created. So I am also being created. And also, I'm being seen by the divine in each moment. So what makes me become, more connected is that realization that I am in his presence and I'm being seen, regardless of the worship. Like when I go through my everyday life, I need to have that awareness, that consciousness that I am being seen by the creator, right now, so I could act in the best way. I would be able to make the best choices that would come out of, my, givenness, my given nature. So one side of this is to realize that I'm impotent, I'm weak, like as a human, we are very fragile and vulnerable at any time, and embracing this vulnerability also gives us the power and strength to connect with the creator. So the seed, the essence of it is to realize and embrace our own vulnerability. And I think during these times, this is the probably the most understood concept with the situation and the COVID situation right now. We feel it every day. We remember it every day. It is a constant reminder to us, and we need to seek this refuge from for protection from the creator. So this realization of being in his presence all the time, at any moment, even when I'm sleeping. Like before I go to sleep, I do make my prayers because I don't know whether or not in the morning I will be able to wake up, right? So we are that vulnerable. But that keeps us in connection with Him. Our needs, our vulnerability, our weakness, that keeps us connected with Him. And the belief in our tradition is believing in the unseen. We don't see the Creator, it's unseen, but we believe in Him because we witness His creation here in this world. We are a witness, and we witness the creation in here. So, this holiness, becoming holy in our understanding, is becoming closer to understand that I'm in his presence all the time, I'm being seen all the time, and I'm responsible for my actions, not only for myself, but also for my community. Like, what do I do with this awareness? Like, what do I do with this understanding that I am here being seen by the divine at any moment? And how do I act with this responsibility? How do I reflect this in my social life?
Thank you.
Mhm.
And Pastor, defining holiness, what say you?
Well, let me also just say what a joy it is to be here together with all of you. And I want to thank Abraham's Table for continuing to provide these opportunities for conversation, and especially for continuing to provide the three of us the opportunity to get together and talk, because it's just so much fun, as well as just I learn so much, as has been said already, but it's a real opportunity for us to just, stop and think about these things that, this topic in particular is one that has given me time, or provided me with some time to just, think about and reflect on this concept that, we use all the time, and I think don't really have an opportunity to kind of dig into as much as we'd like. So I appreciate this opportunity to do that. I think the other beautiful thing about these conversations is that you hear so much commonality among what we all say. And so the benefit I have of going third is that you're going to hear me affirm a lot of what has already been said by my colleagues just a few moments ago. And so I thought I think there's a couple of things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking. One is that the meaning of holy is theological and not moralistic. And so I think you've heard that already in what we've been talking about, that it's really rooted in our understanding of who God is and our relationship with God, and what that means for then who we are and how we try to live, rather than a moralistic kind of notion that, we're that holier than thou kind of connotation that sometimes it gets used. So um, Zuleika was talking about purity, for example, and I think we'll see in that in our conversation today, all of us talking about, seeking kind of to be more closer to who God wants us to be, that notion of purity. But I think it's not, when we talk about holy, this sort of moralistic concept of purity that sometimes gets thrown around. So that was just one thing that I've been thinking about in terms of definition. And I think that's important because, as we all affirm, human beings reflect both the goodness of God and, we're made in the image of God, but also this sinfulness of humanity, our vulnerability as we were just talking about. And so being able to understand holy in the real context of both those things is kind of a challenge. I think in the Christian tradition, we pull a lot in our understanding of holy from that kind of original Hebrew meaning of being cut off or being separated, something that God sets apart as holy, something set apart or dedicated for the service of God. And so, I was thinking about how this plays out in how we understand both God in the Christian tradition and the church, and then the people of God. And so in Christianity, because we have this Trinitarian faith in which we understand in this very confusing way, God is three persons. We have these manifestations of God as, Jesus being set apart as the Word of God, as the Holy One of God. We have this understanding of God, the Holy Spirit, God being in and among us, and that the holy is both somehow altogether different from the created world and yet very much in the world and present with us. And the Holy Spirit being this presence, but also the work of God here and now in our individual lives, in the church, in the world. And then when we're talking about the church and holiness in the context of the church, again, we go back to this idea that, each of us and the church itself is a mix somehow of, saint and sinner, of the goodness of God and the sinfulness of humanity. And so the church itself, is a human sinful institution. But because we see Christ as holy or God as holy, we think of the church as holy in the sense that it is set apart to bear witness to Christ's holiness, to God's salvation, God's liberation in the world. And then I think when we're talking about us as individuals, as people in the Christian tradition, we use the word sanctification. And this is really Christian action. This is, the idea that God's love and forgiveness sets us free to live righteously, to live in right relationship with God and with the world. And so this idea of sanctification is sort of freedom to make holy, to be set apart by virtue of belonging to God and transformed by God in a way that is not conformed to the world, that asks us to live differently than sort of, the world because of our relationship with God, but at the same time is not otherworldly, is not fleeing the world, but very much like living in the world in this way that God is calling us to be. So there's a theologian, Shirley Guthrie, who has said, holiness means a protest against the ways and claims of the world, but it means, but it still means to be living in the world and acting out that holiness in the context of the world. So there's this constant kind of like understanding and what it means to be holy and holding all of those things together. The last thing I'll say is just, I think we understand holiness as kind of costly. that it's nonconformist, that it requires some sacrifice, that there's an opposition to the status quo. It requires risk. It requires protest. Giving up in really specific ways, giving up attachment to money, being against violence, loving one's enemy, all those attachments of the world. In a way, holiness is something that asks us to, to stand in protest against those things that are inconsistent with God. So.
Thank you. You all gave us a lot to unpack there. So maybe we can tease this out a little bit to give everybody a chance to think a little bit more about it. Rabbi, how about some examples of holiness?
Well, there's a lot running through my mind right now, just as I'm even, as I was listening. Certainly there are those things that we see and recognize as holy, and maybe that's a differentiation from holiness, like holiness perhaps being that sense of self being holy. But the reason why I say there are items that are and rituals that are holy, like I mentioned that candle, right? A candle is a candle is a candle. But if I'm lighting the candle on Friday night and I'm saying the prayer that acknowledges that this action I am taking is not just a regular lighting a candle, it's being done as a means to acknowledge that Shabbat, the Sabbath, is starting. That's holy. So it's taking something rather mundane and raising it up to having that deeper meaning, and maybe having that stronger connection. That I always hesitate to use the term higher sense, only because the thing that really struck me as I was listening to all of what we were saying is a lot of this is grounded in a very strong theology. And, I wonder for the people who are watching, because, obviously we don't see them. So for somebody whose theology perhaps is not so clearly defined, or they're struggling to try and figure out what sort of theology rings true for them, this idea of holiness seems maybe seems further away. But that's why I say, the nice thing, I guess, as I look at it through my Jewish eyes is, whether in Judaism, theology is a little bit more, or I should say less defined, depending upon certainly whether you are more observant or more traditionally minded or more progressively minded. But the reason I say that is because even the person who is not sure of their own connection with God can still see the holiness in lighting a Shabbat candle, right? And again, there's a whole variety of actions that we would identify as holy, and really what makes them holy, like I said, the lighting the candle. I'm just lighting a candle, but because I'm shifting it in my mind and mindful of what I'm doing, and that I'm doing it for a reason. And for many people, because whether it's because God commanded it, us to do it as Jews, or whether it's because it's the ritual that we have done, and that could be the lighting the candles, it could be the prayers that we do at specific times, whether it's during the Sabbath, or one of the things when Dr. Kolak mentioned that notion of going to bed and not being sure of, hopefully you're going to wake up in the morning, totally ringing true with Judaism. The first prayer you say when you get up, because what would you normally do? You get up, you go to the bathroom, you do, your morning routine. And in Judaism, no, getting up is a holy thing. So, the traditional among us would say, Modeh ani lefanecha, this prayer that says, thank you, God, for waking me up in the morning and putting my soul back and giving me that opportunity for a new day. So that's the thing, is I guess it's these examples of holiness are using rituals for sure, but being mindful to be able to take something that's just a regular action and raising it up. And in those moments is when we can feel that kind of holiness. Again, you might like candles, but if you ask, sitting at I'll give one more quick example. Sitting at a table with family is really a wonderful thing to do. God willing, we'll be able to do that some point soon, have more people at our table. But if you're sitting at that table and among the things on the table, again, from a Jewish perspective, are matzah and bitter herbs, and there's a Seder plate, and you have a Haggadah, the story, and you're telling it together, that's not just a meal. That's a Passover Seder. That's holiness. Those are those rituals and the stories and the being together. So I think that, in Judaism, those are the examples, is when we take something that's regular and we realize, oh, no, this is something special. This is something more. This is something related to God, like however you want to, say those terms.
Professor, do you want to comment on anything the rabbi just said, or share your own examples of holiness?
Yeah, I would like to share a verse which is, which talks about and responds to this question. It says, "Say, all believers, we have believed in God and what has been revealed to us, and what has been revealed to Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the descendants, and what was given to Moses and Jesus, and what was given to the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we are believers in submission to Him." So this example is actually giving us so many other examples as well that we can all come together and share. So this wholeness in the tradition, like the continuation of the message through different traditions, and also at the same time being able to benefit from the wisdom of each tradition. I think it gives us so many examples, and one example that has affected me so much, so that because of my name being Züleyha, the story of Joseph has become like a story I kept working on in the different traditions in the Bible and the Quran for years. So the story of Joseph actually shows us how you can be connected in the ups and downs of your life. So what is very much distinct in his story is that even in the depth of a well, or when he was sold as a slave, or when he was the sultan, the minister, and the rule, when he was the rule, he was connected all the time. That's the gist of the story. After working on him, on the story for years, that's my conclusion. Like, he is such an example of being connected, being holy at all times, like turning each moment into a holy moment by being connected to the Creator, to the by being aware that this is not something random, this is not happening haphazardly, it's coming from the Creator, it's coming from the source. So I receive this with that awareness. When you think something is coming to your way haphazardly, like randomly, like you are tempted to say, why me? Why me? People say this a lot, because we don't realize that it is sent on purpose to our way, so that we get our lessons, so that we can relate, so that we learn from that. So his journey and his connectedness, I think, is a very good example. And also towards the end, the verse says, we make no distinction between any of them. This is also present in some prophetic traditions as well, that the companions of the prophet ask him about other prophets, and he says, do not make any distinction. And how do we understand that? What does that mean? I think one way of understanding it is that the message that comes to us through different traditions are so rich and so deep that make no distinction, just benefit from whatever wisdom you can find in each tradition. So from that perspective, I think the examples, the models, because they are archetypes. The prophetic examples in the Revelation are archetypes for us to relate to them. It's not a historical story that we learn, what happened in the history, but we relate to them. It's an archetype. Everything in the story has a part of it. I can be in that. I can be Joseph at sometimes. I can be, in his shoes. I can put myself or realize my position in this situation as he was in the depth of the well. When there is no way you can connect with the rest of the world. There is only one way you connect with the creator, and who is the most powerful and most compassionate. So what matters for us to be in these situations is the prophet Jonah's example talks about the same thing. He was swallowed in the belly of a whale, right? There is no way he can connect with the rest of the world. Nobody can hear him. It's dark at night and he is in the middle of the sea. Even if he would scream, nobody would hear him except the creator. And he makes this prayer, and it's interesting because his prayer doesn't make any request. It just says, oh God, I am weak, I'm impotent, and I have no power over everything. You have the power over everything. You are in control of everything. So by making this distinction, by realizing our true reality, even though in life sometimes we are up and down, we are connected and disconnected, we forget this reality, but we are weak, we are not in power. And all those claims and illusions that we may have at some times in our lives are actually in vain. It's not true. Like that, we realize this especially when we are in vulnerable situations. And the prophet Jonah's example also teaches that. So the revelation is full of examples, and I'm sure we can relate to each other very well in these terms. Thank you.
Thank you. Pastor Kate, you want to comment on anything Zuleyha said, or did you have an example of holiness you wanted to share?
Yeah, so I'm probably going to refer back to both things that were said, because I'm just seeing so many connections here. I was actually thinking of the story of Moses when we were thinking of examples, primarily because there's this moment at the burning bush where there's this specific interaction between God and Moses that's, take off your sandals, you're standing on holy ground. And so I wanted to look back at that and think more about what that's about. And just to recall the story a little bit, Moses is going about his business and comes up to this bush that looks like it's burning, but it's not, falling apart. And here's this voice that says, calling his name. And then this voice says, come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you were standing is holy ground. And then this voice that Moses hears is self-identified as God. And the question is, what makes this ground holy in this moment, right? What turns it from a place where Moses was walking a few minutes before to a place where he has to honor this tradition of something holy, something we respect, requiring us to take off our shoes? What is that transformative moment? And so there's Terence Fredheim, who's a commentator, talks about this and says, the ground in that story is now holy because of God's appearance, first of all, not because it was already holy. So there's no intrinsic holiness here. And that's going back to what Rabbi Klopper was saying about the candle, right? The candle can be just a candle that we enjoy, or it can be transformed into this holy thing in this holy moment. And so then the question is, what is that transformation that happens? And it seems that it's because of the divine purpose for that place. And so again, just picking up the threads of what has already been said here, the divine purpose for that candle, or the for the table that's been set, the elements that are on it, and so it's what's interesting to me about it is that it seems to be more than just divine presence that makes something holy, but that it's that purpose set in it, that this that there's been something set apart for this place. And we see in that story of Moses that that place gets set apart for a divine purpose in the future, not just in this moment with Moses, but that becomes a place that is, holy on several occasions. And so, if it's something about being set apart because of God's intention for it, I'm thinking in the Christian tradition, we see this similar to, the table being set for the Sabbath. On the communion table, we have ordinary bread, ordinary wine or juice, and somehow those things become holy in the ritual and the transformation that happens in communion. However, Christians of different strands understand that to make sense. And so, the other thing I think is just because we're in the Advent and leading up to Christmas season, we're kind of diving in right now into the birth story of Jesus and looking at that again and revisiting that as we always do this time of year. And I'm struck by just this notion in all of these biblical stories about our understanding that there's some kind of divide between the divine and human. And yet we see God crossing that all the time, that there's this almost, some sense it's almost an apocalyptic, like breaking of that barrier, that divide. I'm a big Marvel movie fan. And so if anybody knows what I'm talking about, it's like Doctor Strange when he does his swirly thing and all of a sudden the dimensions break open, right? Like there's something in this moment of holiness about that divide being shattered. And so it's capturing both these very real world stories with ordinary people and God giving purpose and intention to both those people and places and objects and all of those things.
Before we move on to our next question, there was a church that just burned down in New York City. I believe it was yesterday, and so horrific. So I just wondered if you could just briefly touch on the idea of a holy space, which Pastor just brought up, and the fact that we can't all be worshiping the way we maybe traditionally have, and how do we find holy space amidst this time? So Rabbi, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I have to say, first of all, I may never look at Doctor Strange the same way again. And if I could maintain that Marvel movie connection, look, I know that for a lot of people, that association of holiness flows strongly with the place of worship, as if that is, for many people within a faith community, that becomes their sort of lens of holiness. Whatever happens through the lens of my faith tradition, and especially the place where my faith tradition happens. You know, that's where holiness is, right? So I would imagine, and I know that I did hear about that tragic story, and you know, I heard some interviews of church members, and you know, of course, they're devastated, but I at least heard one person basically speak in the way that and Pastor, this is where the Marvel connection, you know, one of my favorite movies of the Marvel world is actually Thor Ragnarok, where there's this moment where it's said several times that Asgard is not a place, Asgard is a people. It was kind of the message being that it's not always about the location, right? That their people could, anywhere where they gather can still be that, if you will, that place for them. And I think that, especially in the Jewish tradition, you know, one of the things that's very clear in the Jewish tradition is that when it comes to rituals, which are really those moments that all of us have, regardless of your faith community, are those moments to bring in the divine, to feel God's presence, if you're, you know, kind of into those kinds of theological terms. But the holiness especially comes when you're able to do these seminal rituals. And keep in mind that half of the rituals, at least half, if not more, of the rituals in Judaism are done at home. Yeah, they come here for services and for certain moments, but you know, that lighting of the candles that I mentioned, that's supposed to happen at home. So, you know, for the Jewish community, and I think it can be said for any community, right? That, you know, yes, it's nice to be able to have our location where we are. But, you know, one of the most beautiful things I remember is over the past few years, there have been some interfaith community programs that have, you know, in the Huntington area that have involved teens. And one of my favorite things is I think we had a program at Our Lady Queen of Martyrs. And as part of that program, there had to be a time when the Muslim group went and prayed. And that was phenomenal. We were in the Catholic Church, and the Muslims were still able to pray there. You know, we gave them their space, and they were so gracious and invited us to, not that we had to walk away, that we could share that moment with them. So I think what's neat is, you know, when to hear that a church burns down, or a synagogue, or a masjid or mosque, it's awful. But to know that maybe if we are talking about holiness being an opportunity to engage with the divine, to know that we can do that, and it doesn't have to be inside the church or the mosque or the temple, it can, or the synagogue. It can be wherever we come together and say, hey, let's do this, that we can have holiness there.
Dr. Kolak, anything you wanted to add to those comments?
Yeah, I would like to add that the holy space in the Quran, in the in our book, is described as, you know, we have a few concepts that fall into that category. Which one of them is Kaaba, the, you know, where the, you know, pilgrim is done, and once a year or once in a lifetime, depending on our, you know, financial state. And the other one is masjid, the place of worship. So this concept of masjid is different than mosque. Mosque is, you know, specifically solely devoted to the worship. But masjid can be anywhere. Like one room in your home may be masjid. Or there is also the verse in the Quran, it says that the earth is your masjid. The earth is your place of worship. So I think we wouldn't be wrong if we say that right now Zoom is the holy space for us. Right now we meet on the, you know, cloud, right? We are not even on earth. We are in atmosphere somewhere meeting together. So it's the holy space for us now. So there is no excuse, because I mean, for our 5 daily prayers, there is no excuse, like, you know, because we need this connection all the time. We need our hearts, our, souls, our spirits. We need that connection. We need to nurture ourselves to remember that, we are, being protected, we are safe, we are loved, and we are, you know, we have compassion towards us. So I think right now the, 21st century concept of holiness is, Zoom or cloud, let's say more generally. Thank you.
Just to remind the viewers, if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat and we'll be asking our panel. But Dr. Kate, anything you wanted to add to holy space before we move on?
I just, this Middle Collegiate Church and its standing in New York City is so powerful. I mean, the loss of their building is really, it's it's just one of those gut things that you can imagine the devastation is hard to even comprehend. But at the same time, that particular congregation and their pastor talk all the time about revolutionary love, and that their purpose as a community of faith is about being revolutionary love in the world. And since that happened, Jackie Lewis, their pastor, has emphasized how that doesn't stop because they've lost their building, and as they continue to grieve so deeply that holy space that they have, and that has been lost so tragically. At the same time, they know that loss can't stop this revolutionary love that they live out in the world. And that has, I think, been a really powerful testimony just in the wake of that, and an important conversation that I think we're all having in the midst of this pandemic about, we've been saying likewise that the church is not a building. It's, the church is, the language we use is the church is the body of Christ in the world, but it's, we're all saying the same thing, that it's living out our faith in the world, at the same time recognizing that our spaces do have taken on this holiness, that we call them sanctuaries, or for a reason. And if you ask my kids, who will tell you that every vacation they feel like they spend more time visiting sanctuaries or synagogues, or in different places that we travel to, I'm always overwhelmed by the beauty of and the power that is in those spaces. And yet I think we've learned really important lessons and been pushed as faith communities to understand better our purpose, the reason, God is asking us to do and be in the world in this time when we can't locate ourselves sometimes the way we do, in a very insular way, within our buildings.
Thank you. Hopefully Abraham's Table will be able to visit each other's worship spaces in the near future. Pastor Kate, let me just go back to you. Is there a personal experience of searching for holiness you wanted to share, or what is holy living in everyday life?
Well, as I was thinking about this question, I thought of just two things. And the first kind of connects to what we were just talking about. So I'll start with that. And that's a sort of theology of place. And this is something that's always interested me, probably because I moved around a lot as a kid. And so I've become aware of how I look for the holy in different places, right? But one expression of this comes to us from Celtic spirituality, and that's the idea of thin places. These places where that distance or boundary between heaven and earth collapses, or the divine feels particularly close. Some people describe this as an encounter, especially of the holy and the created, or the natural world. I can think of specific hikes I've taken, for example, where I feel this profound sense of holiness, but also, you know, in places and experiences and moments where I've encountered people doing God's work. So, you know, I'm recalling an experience that I had, you know, witnessing volunteers in a soup kitchen, and seeing that very much as kind of a holy moment. So this idea that there can be places, and you know, that where we have this moment of encounter with God that somehow helps us see the intention that God has for us. The second thing I was thinking about is just vocation, and the idea that that holy living in everyday life is very much connected to our vocation, no matter what it is. So, you know, you know, I may be clergy now, but I wasn't in my former vocation. And yet I very much understood vocation as a call to live out my faith in the world. And by that, again, I'm not talking about something moralistic, but just this idea that like God sets us all apart for certain work in the world. And so whatever your life's work is, whatever your vocation is, it can be really holy if in the way that you understand it as God setting you apart for that work. So I was a lawyer in my previous career, and I had the privilege of witnessing, for example, I wasn't a public defender myself, but I worked with a lot of public defenders, and I've always said the work that I saw them do was really holy work. It was walking along somebody who had a lot of times no one else to stand by their side. And so I think that's an example of how I see holiness in people's vocations. And I think we could have a whole separate conversation about, you know, our particular vocations, but yeah, I think that's a place where I see that holy living in everyday life.
Rabbi, how about you? A personal experience of searching for holiness or holiness in everyday life?
Well, you know, as you sort of said the question today, and as you know, I listened to the first response, I actually had a very interesting memory pop into my head. You know, when the talk of like previous life. Now, in my case, I didn't have a previous vocation, but being a rabbi was not the dream I had when I was a kid. I mean, it wasn't like, ooh, I want to be a rabbi. It was sort of you know, sort of a conflagration of different events and different things that brought me on this path, if you will. And actually, I can point to a reluctancy when I was at the cusp of making the decision, am I going to go to rabbinical school or not? And one reluctancy I had was this idea of being seen as the holy person 24/7. Because you know what? I like to sit on my couch and watch a basketball game or a football game. I mow my lawn. And when I'm mowing my lawn, I'm not walking around going, Baruch atah Adonai, you know, and I'm not davening, and I'm not wearing, you know, a kippah and a you know, and I think sometimes the perception, especially of clergy, is that's exactly what they do. You know, and I've said this before, my kids have seen me in my Elmo pajamas. I mean, you know, so this sense of 24/7 holiness was actually an obstacle to me. And then I guess that's the thing is, again, through the Jewish eyes, the one thing that became very plain to me or obvious is you can't have that expectation. Because, you know, again, if the definition of holiness to some extent is, you know, connected with being divine-ish or somehow emulating God-esque or at least, this idea of there are things that are just regular, and there are things that are holy, like set apart. Then what that means is there has to be those times when things are just regular, when mowing the lawn is just mowing the lawn. So that actually was kind of a powerful thought for me. Especially again, I spend a lot of my day not praying, but doing things that I need to do. It's computer work, or it's calling people. And sometimes there's a holiness in there. And sometimes it's just, I need to, fill out some paperwork because there's something that, needs to be fixed, or whatever it is. So I think that's it. It's like recognizing that there definitely are holy moments, that are moments of holiness, might even be a better way to put it. And one of the things that I have found in my life is that, that's the beauty of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is intended, for us, as we call it Shabbat, it's intended to be that time of holiness. It's supposed to be set aside from the rest of the week, because we're doing stuff. We're doing, most people are working during the rest of the week, and we don't have the luxury of stopping and appreciating and feeling that holiness. And I think it would be overwhelming to assume anyone who thinks that they are going to live a 24/7 life of holiness. I'd say more power to you, but I think it's an unachievable goal. Again, I'd love to think that, I don't mean this sacrilegiously, but would the Pope play a round of mini golf if he had the opportunity? I would imagine so, because that's what all of us clergy, we do regular things. And I think all of us as human beings, we do regular things. And what's really neat, what's really powerful, is we have these moments that we can raise up. It is a mindfulness thing. And I think all of us have been addressing that, if not directly, but indirectly. It's when we allow our minds and our bodies and our souls to kind of take a collective breath and say, this is a moment. This is a moment that I'm standing with the divine, or I'm standing and doing something of higher meaning, and whatever it may be. That's powerful. And again, I try every, one of the things I'll sort of, end with this thought is, on most holidays, I'm working. I'm running a service. I'm making sure that all the components will come together to create a powerful moment of holiness, hopefully for my community. Does that mean it's the most holy thing for me? Not always, because I'm worried about, is this piece going to work, and is this going to come together? And especially as Dr. Kolak says, Zoom is our new place of holiness. So is the video going to work? Is the audio going to work? There's a lot of those things that I think are hindrances to holiness. But there are moments like, just for me, everybody talks about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because those are the big ones. Like Easter and Christmas are the big ones. Like, certainly Ramadan, a lot of focus, and Eid and whatnot. But right after Yom Kippur is done, a few days later, we have Sukkot, which is a holiday where we're supposed to erect these booths like our ancestors supposedly did as they wandered through the wilderness, that, kind of a temporary booth. That's holiness, because what I do is I make one at home, and I'm able to just kind of make it on my own and spend some time in it. And so those are the moments when I can put everything else aside and say, this is going to be holy for me. That's an example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Kolak, how about for you, a personal experience or a holiness in everyday life?
This is a great question, because we used to go to worship in holy spaces in the past, before the pandemic, right? Because our goal was to seek this holiness to seek the closeness to the Creator. But now these spaces have been transformed into selfless acts. How do we seek the how do we seek to please God? Now we go to, we turn them into acts of charity. Now we serve, I think we can call it service, right now. Worship equals to service right now. Like the food banks, the homeless shelters or the blood donation centers, these places are now the transformed holy spaces where we can seek the pleasing to the Creator. So one leg of our understanding of holiness is service in the community. So these are the vulnerable moments that we all go through as the whole world. And we have this concept of active patience. So patience is not just to sit there and try to keep calm. It's you just go out and do your best to serve. When you do this service, even in the most vulnerable moments, in the most painful moments, this is what keeps us alive. To be able to serve and to be able to realize that with our service we can touch in other lives and make an impact on the life of the community. And that is also right now, I think, the most important way of seeking holiness in everyday life. What else we can do? I mean, we can see the results in our hearts. When we do such a service, we feel that yes, I did the right thing. I was able to serve. I was able to help somebody. So I think, just because, for example, just right now on the screen we have each tradition represented. This is a space of holiness. Like we brought together all these traditions, and we are seeking together the understanding of how we can be closer, how we can seek holiness. I think right now in everyday life, that is the most important part. And in my personal life, when I felt the most closest, the most holy in my life is, I think, my failure times. I have a huge failure in my life when I was around 18 or 19, in my first years of college. This was an American university in Turkey. So this was my first college experience. I was a freshman, and I was so much, excited about reading and reading and reading about these, it was a search for meaning for me. So nothing mattered after high school. Nothing mattered except understanding and making sense of the world. And that year, I remember, I didn't go to school, even though it was my first year at college. And then at the end of the year, this was a prep school for English. And after that year, 2 years actually, you take an exam, and that determines whether or not you will be able to continue on your education, because the instruction is in English. And I failed. This was like, I was the top student in my high school. This is the best school I could get into. And after those 2 years of just diving into readings and sharing all the time, I failed in going to my classes, and I failed in my exam. And that meant for me that I had one more chance, one more year to take one more time that exam, and I failed in that one as well. So that moment I realized that it was a huge failure for me, the first huge failure in my life. But it made a tremendous impact on my life. Like, it was hard, it was really hard. Like, I remember the day I learned the result of the exam. It was very hard, but it made me connect with the Creator in a different way. It opened up a new way of submission to this thing. Even though I worked so hard for 1 year, eventually to get this and pass this, it's a very rare opportunity for me. And then, I just failed. So that vulnerability brought into my life the most precious understanding. Like, it gave me an opportunity to search the meaning of it in the most difficult ways. But eventually, I realized that, I was in the physics department there, and I realized that I'm, more into language and literature, and this is what I should pursue. And this is like a, lifetime opportunity given to me to search for my own passion. So, I think those are the opportunities that we find in ourselves, what makes ourselves. So I think in a way it is, in the same lines of finding yourself, because in our understanding, you need to know yourself to know the creator, to get closer to him. We need to know ourselves first, our own true reality. And this was my turning point, that I understood that to serve, the world, I need to be in a profession where I am with languages and, literature. And it helped me to bring together all my interests, actually, and, to combine everything. So the, Islamic studies and, the, um, prophetic stories in the literature, that helped me to bring together everything. And I think these times, the most vulnerable times that we go through, gives us an opportunity to realize this active patience by doing something, by helping someone in the community in the way it's possible. And, to be in the service, active service of the community. That is the seeking holiness, I think, in everyday life.
Thank you for sharing that powerful story. Just picking up on this idea of community, Pastor Kate, is this idea of holiness relevant in our society today? And how can holiness have an impact on our larger community?
Yeah, I think it really flows from what Dr. Kolak was just saying, which is I think there's this strong connection between holiness and justice. And, my sense of scripture is that God clearly intends for us, for this relationship we have with the divine, to involve a participation in God's work of justice, of peace, of love in the world. And, that's kind of where we find holy, holy moments, holy work, and it's a work we all share as people of faith. I think it's very common, and connects all of us. And it sort of poses these questions, like how do we recognize the holiness in one another so that we might do holy work together? How do we get to that point where we're really seeking that transformation of our community and our world in a way that that enables that, God's work of justice to be evident and to be manifest in the world. And I think that's sort of going back, Rabbi Clapper, to what you were saying too about, the role of clergy. I totally agree that, like, holiness from personal holiness is harder for me to achieve probably than anybody else. But I think the as part of it, I guess I see the role of clergy is to sort of point to the holiness, right? Like, to help us see where it is in the world. And so Dr. Kolak, you were just really, I think, pointing to something really important, which is it's where we are, working together to transform this world into something more just.
If I may, I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, and I apologize. It's actually really a fascinating question. that which I love the idea and firmly believe in the idea of seeing holiness in other people. That holiness does exist in other people, and I am confident in saying that the people that I'm looking at right now all feel that way, because we're the kind of people who will affiliate and connect with something like Abraham's table. And I guess one of the things that maybe is a point of frustration for me is some of our co-religionists who will monopolize the definition of holiness to the point where they can define it away or out of other people. I.e., if you don't believe the way that I believe, if your value structure is not the way that my value structure is, you have no capacity for holiness at all, and therefore are worthy of being rejected. And it's like a frustration, obviously. This session is not about the divisiveness of the world that we're living in right now, but we know that it's certainly part of the backdrop. And one of the things I really appreciated in what Pastor Kate said was this idea of, if only we would, our first reaction would be, oh, you're a human being, there's holiness in you. It would go so much further to being able to foster conversation, as opposed to the opposite, which is, I think, what happens now, is if you're red or if you're blue, if you're this or if you're that, if you believe X or if you believe Y, then therefore only that falls into the category of potential for holiness. Or perhaps even more so, if you believe the other way, then it's completely, holiness is not possible. And that's a place where perhaps religion has undone itself.
If I can add something to the point that Rabbi Klopper just made, human being is, human heart actually is the place of God. So there is a saying in our tradition that, this is a saying, the wording comes from God, but it comes through the prophet. So it says, I could not settle on earth, but I was able to reside and settle in the heart of a human. So the Rumi is understanding that when you encounter with someone, you see the heart first. You connect with that heart, with that human heart first. So is the place of God, is the holy space that you can find God in there. So I think that gives us, that takes out all the colors in our eyes, all the labels in our eyes, just to see a person as a human being and see the holy space of God in the heart of a human being. I think it's such an amazing truth that we can all find each other. I think find a place where we can connect and be holy together.
Does anybody else have anything they want to share before we move on about holiness in community? Any other thoughts there?
There's this really great, actually, as you asked the question that way, there's this great Jewish teaching that points out, remember I mentioned the phrasing in the book of Leviticus, you shall be holy for I, God, am holy. What's interesting is, again, not a big grammar lesson, but the way that the word holiness, which it's beautiful, it warms my heart to know that I imagine in Arabic and in Hebrew, there's a lot of overlap in structures and whatnot. But what's fascinating is that when God says to Moses, you shall be holy, speak to the whole community, the word holiness, or holy, is plural. It's kiddushim. It's not a singular word. So there's this wonderful interpretation that says holiness isn't just a thing you find or achieve in singularity or in isolation, that it's something that has to be done through the lens of a community working together. And I've always really, appreciated that sort of idea, that holiness comes not when I sit back and go, I'm holier than thou, but how is it that we can be together, and in that moment together, that's when we can feel holy. The holiness is there with us. So,
And just one other point about that, I think this conversation is really helpful because it reminds us that it's God who's holy, right? And that we are all, by virtue of that relationship, that so anyone who claims um, who claims holiness for themselves exclusively, I think is missing the point on what the holy is. And Christians do that far too often, I'll just say.
All right, so our final question, we only have a few more minutes. Maybe you could each speak to this just for a couple of minutes before we conclude, is that this idea of holidays, and the rabbi spoke about it briefly before, or holy days, indicates that time has holiness. So what does that mean for you, the idea of holiness in relation to time? And Dr. Kolak, maybe you could speak to this first.
I mean, this is a beautiful aspect. I think we are looking into the time from a perspective of holiness. We can think of this holy times in each tradition. First of all, like Ramadan in our tradition, when the day before Ramadan and the day after Ramadan started is not the same, is not considered the same. Because when it started, it's like a breeze, you expect it to start in those certain hours. And then once it starts, you believe that everything you do, all the goodness, all the good acts, services, acts of charity, multiplied with thousands and millions, it's such a time that you can, I mean, it is said in the Quran that it's the time that Quran was revealed. So the time isn't being created in the same way. It is a special time. It's like this opening up in the time, like a huge channel for us to wholeheartedly submit ourselves and to connect with the creator through our acts, through our fasting, through our worship. And we also have these holy moments through the prayer times that we have during the day. So there is a certain moment that the prayer time starts. So these 5 daily prayers times, such as early in the morning, let's say around 6 or 7. So that time, when you look outside, you see that in the creation there is a big change is happening. Like after a huge darkness, a light and a new day is starting. You see that there are color changes in the horizon. There is the birds are chirping and active. They are started moving. So that moment is a holy moment, and you observe what's happening around you in the creation. And the prayer time is to reflect what you have received from that time, that holiness in the time, to the Creator, to say thank you, to glorify Him. So, and the prayer times, especially the beginning of the time, that you observe it so vividly, so alive, different than other times. Like the evening prayer times, for example, right now it's the evening time. And, at the beginning, you observe the color changes and everything, and you can, your heart fills with this blessings and, thankfulness and gratitude. And then with your whole heart you can say, thank you, God, for creating me in this moment and making me witness to these moments. So time is a very mysterious concept, I think. Sometime we get together and 1 hour, just like now, we are talking about holiness, and all these seconds and minutes become, enlightened and energize us to connect us to the Creator. That these enlightened moments in time becomes holy. So we turn them holy by our actions sometimes. There is this holiness that comes from God with these specific times, also in our everyday life, by being busy with actions that take you up to the Creator, that connects you up to the Creator again, also turns these moments into holy moments, I think.
Thank you. Pastor Kate, holy time, what does that mean for you?
I'm so moved by everything you just said, Zuleha, that I'm really percolating on that. Thank you. I think in the Christian year, we follow a liturgical calendar that kind of moves us through, different times of the year and helps us be attentive to what time is, what different times enlighten us to different stories, to different rituals, to different ways of connecting with God. And I think that's helpful. That's sort of like ebb and flow throughout a year. That and we even have a whole period of time in the Christian church called ordinary time. No one really understands what that means, except it's not Lent or Advent or but just the idea that that ordinary time is this holy time as well, and we find holiness in the ordinary. The liturgical calendar helps us to do that, and so I think it moves us through time that way. But of course, we have these specific, again, because Christmas is coming up, and that's on my mind. I'm thinking about all of the hymns that sort of remind us that night is holy in some way. And I think we all have those experiences of particular, as you're talking about, Dr. Kolak, particular being on the edge of, a prayer time or something that you just know is this holy space in time. And so
Thank you. Rabbi, holy time as we finish up here.
I think it's really more of the same of what has been said before. It kind of doubles back on maybe how I address the candle being just a candle. A Monday is just a Monday, a Tuesday is just a Tuesday, a Thursday is just a Thursday, unless it happens to be Christmas Eve, when all of a sudden it's not just Thursday, it's a big day. Or if it's the day before Ramadan, or if it's the Rosh Hashanah that night, the Jewish New Year, or Friday night, it's the Sabbath. I think the beautiful thing about holy time is that's maybe sacrilegious, but time is a human concept, right? We're the ones who come up with this idea of time. And our time, of course, is limited. And so it would be easy enough to just live every day, wake up, do what we do, and then go to sleep, then wake up, do what we do. But instead, we have these moments that come from our faith traditions that help us stop, if you will, to a certain extent, but not, and recognize that there's deeper meanings. There are higher elements than just wake up, live the day, and then go to bed. So I think that holy time, just as time is a human concept, in a way holy time is, but what it does is it allows us to have these moments when it's separate, or we raise ourselves up, or we, again, a higher perspective, or a closer connection with God. But the nice thing about our faith communities is they have those moments built in for us. We don't have to make them up on our own. They have it as a structure. And maybe if it encourages us to me, the win is when people see those moments that are mandated by a faith community as a template to be able to find other moments in their lives, so that maybe next Wednesday, though it's not a holiday, you create a moment of exceptionalism, because and holiness in that moment, because you know what it feels like, what is sort of involved, in order to create and carve out that holy time.
Thank you for wrapping us up in that way. Happy Hanukkah, which is your holy day coming very soon, a holy time coming soon.
Kind of minor, but yeah.
And unfortunately, we are out of time on the topic of time, but I want to thank our expert panels. Thank you to Mehmet for all of our tech support, and Dr. Kubek. Thank you all for joining us at Abraham's Table. Again, you can go to our website, abrahamstableli.org, for more information about our upcoming event. Join us January 17th, Sunday, for our MLK celebration, and that'll be at 4 o'clock. And Dr. Kubek, any final thoughts?
Well, I want to wish everybody happy holiday and thank our panelists. This was fabulous. And during the course of the panel, you reminded me of something from my childhood. Christians are now going to get into the annual discussion about the holiness of Christmas and the secularity, the sacred and the profane, and Santa Claus and Christmas trees. And you reminded me as I was listening, I was reflecting on my childhood when my parents put out cookies and milk to convince me that Santa Claus was coming. And the next morning, I must have been 4 or 5, but I still remember like it was gone and Santa Claus is real. And this really has nothing to do with Christmas, but it has everything to do with Christmas, because that was a holy moment. And I still remember it many, many decades later. And I thank you all for being holy.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all for joining us.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to share. It's an
Thank
absolute
you.
pleasure. Thank you.